Welcome to About Scripture, a podcast designed to take the listener deeper into Scripture and biblical thought. I'm Ed Gallagher, professor of Christian Scripture at Heritage Christian University. I hope to cover a variety of topics with you about Scripture. This podcast is brought to you in partnership with Heritage Christian University, where we help students to thrive in ministry. To find out more, go to hcu.edu. We're also partnering with the Ministry League Network. They have free resources to help the local church all over the world. Download the app in the iOS or Play Store, or check out the website at ministryleague.com. And now, welcome to the podcast.
We're going to talk about the Hebrew term Satan today and all the places that it appears in the Hebrew Bible. This is probably the one you've been waiting for if you knew enough to wait for it. Here it is. We don't know Satan's name. Or let me put it this way, the being we know of as Satan does not have a name in the Bible. Yes, the word Satan appears plenty in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, but it's a title or description rather than a name. The Hebrew word Satan means, well, actually the meaning is debated, but something like adversary. And in the Hebrew Bible, the word Satan applies to more characters than just the prince of darkness. Indeed, some scholars argue, just as I will argue, that the word Satan never applies to the prince of darkness in the Old Testament. I know you're thinking of Job. We'll get to that. Now, maybe you're thinking that if his name is not Satan, it must be Lucifer. Well, no, it's not. The word Lucifer came to be associated with Satan through a particular interpretation of Isaiah 14, verse 12. But most of our Bibles don't have the word Lucifer there anymore. And it was never intended to be a name for this being. But we will talk about Isaiah 14 at some later date. The Hebrew word Satan came into Greek as Satanas, so it is also a Greek term, which appears in the New Testament quite a bit. And the Hebrew word was also translated by the Greek word diabolos. All right, so we've got one Hebrew term, Satan, that sometimes just comes straight into Greek as Satanas and sometimes is translated into Greek as diabolos. So diabolos, the devil. Okay. We know that devil is not his name, and that's why we put a definite article, the, in front of the word, the devil. We should probably do the same for the word Satan in the New Testament. We should probably say the Satan or the Satan. Only one time is the word Satanas in the New Testament possibly used as a name. That's Luke 22, verse 3, which is the verse that says, "Then Satanas entered into Judas." There's no definite article there. That's why I say possibly a name. But every other appearance, it's got the definite article. At any rate, whether we know his name or not, we're talking about the chief enemy of God, and we will refer to him as Satan, as if it's his name, which we know it's not, and as the devil. You'll probably be surprised to learn that ancient Judaism says barely anything about the devil or Satan. A chief agent of evil never comes up in Philo or Josephus, and hardly at all in the Apocrypha. In fact, I would say not at all in the Apocrypha. There are a couple of verses, maybe Sirach 21, verse 27, Wisdom 2:24. I think neither one of them actually is talking about Satan, but possibilities. The Dead Sea Scrolls and some other apocalyptic literature do mention sometimes an angelic opponent of God's people, but this angel is rarely or maybe never called Satan. But Satan appears all over the place in the New Testament and other early Christian literature. In the Old Testament, Christians often find Satan in several passages. English Bibles usually print Satan with a capital S as a personal name in three particular passages, and maybe you can already name all three of them. The first two chapters of Job, Zechariah 3, and 1 Chronicles 21. I have already indicated that very likely we should not consider these passages as talking about the prince of darkness, the chief opponent of God. I mean that the use of Satan, the English term Satan with a capital S, as a personal name in English Bibles is a mistake. It is the wrong way of rendering it in English. It would be better to have the definite article, because it's there in Hebrew. So it'd be better to have the definite article, the Satan, with a lowercase s. Or even better than that would just be to translate the term, the adversary. But Christians, besides those passages where the term Satan actually does appear in Hebrew, besides those, Christians also find the prince of darkness in the Old Testament where the term Satan does not appear, such as in the snake in Genesis 3, and the descriptions of rulers in Isaiah 14, which I've already mentioned, and Ezekiel 28. We'll get to those passages later. Since they don't use the term Satan, they're not going to come up in this study. The Hebrew noun Satan appears 27 times in the Hebrew Bible. Now, 17 of those are Zechariah and Job, and then we've already mentioned 1 Chronicles 21. So besides those passages, which are sort of well known as containing this word, let me just read off the other verses where the term occurs. It's not a whole lot. So Numbers chapter 22, verses 22 and 32, 1 Samuel 29, verse 4, 2 Samuel 19, verse 22, 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 4, chapter 11, verse 14, and verse 23, and verse 25, and then Psalm 109, verse 6. That's all of them, and of course, Zechariah, Job, 1 Chronicles 21. All right, let's take these in categories. Sometimes the term Satan refers to a human adversary, a human being. Let me just give you one example. 1 Samuel 29, verse 4. The Philistine commanders are worried about David. David is now living among the Philistines because if he were in Israel, Saul would kill him, so he's run away to the Philistines. The Philistine commanders are worried because they're going into battle against Israel, against Saul, and they're worried that David might become their enemy when they are most vulnerable. If he goes into battle with them against Israel, he's going to turn against them and kill the Philistines. And so they say, but the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him, and the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Send the man back, David, that he may return to the place to which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become a Satan to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here?" So they're worried he's going to become a Satan, an adversary. It certainly does not refer to a, Satan in this passage. An adversary. There are several others. 2 Samuel, that one, human adversary, and all the ones in 1 Kings are human adversaries. And the one in Psalm 109, human adversary. Next category, good angelic adversary. If it can be a good adversary, then this is it. This is the passage in Numbers chapter 22. That's the Balaam passage. Do you remember who comes as an angelic opponent against Balaam. Do you remember who that is? It's the angel of Yahweh who does that. This is Numbers chapter 22, verse 22. But God's anger was kindled because he, that is Balaam, went, and the angel of Yahweh took his stand in the way as his Satan. Now, how is that translated? As his opponent, as his adversary, whatever it is. The text of Scripture calls the angel of Yahweh a Satan here. Obviously not an evil being, even if he is doing something sort of harmful. I don't know if we would call it harmful. I mean, ultimately it's good for Balaam, but standing opposed to him. All right, so sometimes a human being, sometimes a good angelic adversary, this term Satan. Now let's discuss an unclear example. This is the one in Chronicles, 1 Chronicles 21. Some appearances of Satan in the Bible might leave the reader uncertain as to the type of being we're talking about. There is one clear example of unclarity, a known unknown, as Donald Rumsfeld might have labeled it. Actually, it's only an unknown in Hebrew. In English Bibles, the text is usually very clear because the translators have made the interpretation for you. This is one of the values of learning original languages, because you can see what is actually unclear in the text of Scripture, because sometimes your English translators just go ahead and interpret it for you. They do not trust you to arrive at the right interpretation, so they're just going to get that out of the way and give you the right interpretation so that you don't have to worry yourself with that. This is one of those examples, 1 Chronicles 21. The text says, "Then a Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel." This verse is usually translated in English with a capital S, Satan, so that there is no doubt that readers will think of the Prince of Darkness. But the Hebrew text is actually not that clear. It just says an adversary incited David. I prefer that translation because it leaves the matter of interpretation up to the reader, instead of having the translators do that work for you. If our text just says that an adversary incited David to number Israel, who might this adversary be? Well, could be a human being, maybe a foreign king who challenged David's strength. Or could be an angelic adversary sent by God, perhaps the angel of Yahweh, as in the case of Balaam. Or maybe it's Satan. The text is not clear, and I don't know what the right answer is, although I strongly prefer the first two options. Let's remember the parallel passage in 2 Samuel 24. So 1 Chronicles 21, 2 Samuel 24, parallel passages. Those are the passages where David numbers Israel. 2 Samuel 24, where the text does not use the word Satan, but rather it says, "Again, the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, 'Go number Israel and Judah.'" According to 2 Samuel 24, this is God's plan. As we saw previously, sometimes God uses agents to accomplish his purposes, even purposes that are in some way harmful to humans. Think of the 10th commandment. 10th plague, Exodus 12:23. That's mostly why I prefer not to think of Satan in 1 Chronicles 21, because it seems more likely that God would use either a human agent to accomplish his will or one of his own angelic agents, as we see him do in other scriptural passages. On the other hand, I do believe that God can and does use Satan himself to accomplish his purposes, so I don't want to rule out that interpretation. We've gone through 10 examples of Satan. Satan, in the Hebrew Bible. There are 17 more, and they're all concentrated in 2 books. Job, which uses the term 14 times, all in the first 2 chapters, and Zechariah, which uses it 3 times. In both books, the word Satan refers to a celestial being, a supernatural being. If Satan appears anywhere in the Old Testament under that name, it is in one of these books, or both. The word Satan in these 2 books always has the definite article in Hebrew, the Satan, or in Hebrew, ha-Satan. And the Septuagint always translates in these 2 books with the term ha-diabolos, the devil, or the adversary. I mean, how do we want to translate diabolos? We think of it as the devil, but the adversary, the opponent, the slanderer, the something. There are possibilities. In the book of Job, the scene with the Satan takes place in heaven, God's throne room. And the same seems to be true for the scene in Zechariah. Let's start with Zechariah just because it's shorter. The post-exilic prophet Zechariah has a vision of Joshua the high priest. Verses 1 and 2. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of Yahweh, and the Satan standing at his right hand to oppose him. And Yahweh said to the Satan, Yahweh rebuke you, the Satan. Yahweh, who has chosen Jerusalem, rebuke you. Is not this a brand plucked from the fire? What is happening in this scene? If you keep reading, you learn that Joshua is wearing dirty clothes, an offense that brings guilt on him, and according to Exodus 28, verse 43, might result in his death. But he gets to remove those clothes, and he is told in verse 5, I have removed your guilt from you. Put on priestly robes. Then God tells Joshua, if you will walk in my paths, if you will keep my charge, then you will lead my house and guard my courts, and I will allow you to walk among those standing here. Immediately thereafter, we read a prophecy about the coming branch, a messianic title. So what's going on? God is commissioning Joshua as his man, his priest for the current time. Joshua needs to step up and be a leader for God's people. The change of clothes symbolizes the purification of Joshua for his task, with the promise that he will walk among those standing here. That must be a reference to heavenly beings, angels, and confirms that this scene does take place in heaven with angels serving as witnesses. Now, for the part of the passage that we've already quoted, verses 1 and 2, the Satan is doing what to Joshua? The Hebrew verb that appears at the end of verse 1, which describes the actions of this Satan, is a verbal form of Satan. There's a noun in Hebrew, but there's also a verb, Satan. So the meaning of the verb is bound up with the meaning of the noun, and we've already noted that the meaning is in dispute. It means something like oppose, but scholars often give a more precise meaning, usually accuse, which is how the New Revised Standard Version translates the verb in Zechariah 3, verse 1. Ryan Stokes has argued that the translation accuse is off base and that the verb actually means attack. For the moment, let's go with the usual interpretation, that the Satan is accusing Joshua of something. What's the accusation? Most likely he's accusing him of wearing dirty clothes. That is, of being impure, of not being a worthy recipient of God's trust. But even though the accusation is in some ways true, Joshua is in fact wearing dirty clothes. He is impure. God has a plan for Joshua, and so God will purify him. Here's the big question for our study. Who is the Satan? Is the Satan a creature under God's authority, or is he in rebellion against God? What are the Satan's ultimate motives? There's going to be disagreement about this, but I think it's completely possible that the Satan's motives in this passage are to serve God. The role of the Satan here is often compared to a prosecuting attorney, and while that analogy might not be exactly right, it does help us to think through the possibilities. Consider the different officers of the court in our legal system. There's the prosecutor, there's the defense attorney, there's the judge, there are others. Which one is the good guy and which one is the bad guy? Well, none of them are the bad guy. They all have their role to play, even though the prosecutor and the defense attorney are opposed to each other. But they're not opposed in their ultimate goal, which is that justice be done. No prosecutor, not a good one, wants to send an innocent man to prison. No defense attorney wants a criminal to get away with murder, but they play their respective roles, offering vigorous arguments for their side with the confidence that everyone working together in this way will result in justice. What we've got in Zechariah 3 looks like a courtroom scene. God is on the throne. He's the judge, or maybe it's the angel of Yahweh. The Satan plays his part, making sure that Joshua's unworthiness is fully exposed. The Lord knows full well about Joshua's impurity, but he doesn't accept the Satan's accusation because he has plans for Joshua. So the Lord tells the Satan to shut up. But could the Satan be Satan here? The prince of darkness, the enemy of God? I suppose we could follow that interpretation, and certainly many Christian readers have assumed the truthfulness of that interpretation, helped along by their English translations that refer to Satan, unhelpfully in my view. But let's notice what the Satan is not doing here. We usually think about Satan as lying, John 8:44, and tempting people to get them to sin, Matthew 4, Satan in the wilderness with Jesus. This picture of Satan is based on the New Testament, and we'll talk about that later. But the Satan in Zechariah 3 is not doing these things. He is not lying to Joshua or about Joshua. Joshua really is wearing dirty clothes. He really is impure. He really is unworthy of God's confidence. If the Satan is accusing Joshua of wearing dirty clothes, it's an accurate accusation. And the Satan is not trying to get Joshua to sin. He's not tempting Joshua. So he's not doing the things that we normally think about Satan as doing. I prefer the other interpretation, that this Satan is not God's enemy, but God's servant, doing the job assigned him by God. Mostly the reason I lean this way is because we haven't found a being called Satan in the Old Testament that is God's enemy. And since our passage can be read as if this adversary is in God's service, I think that's how ancient Jews would have interpreted the vision. And remember, last time we saw that God employs spiritual beings who do things negative toward humans. Now, Job, and time is escaping us, so we won't cover every aspect of Job, but let's remind ourselves of how that begins in chapter 1, verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of the Elohim came to present themselves before Yahweh, and the Satan also came among them. And if you've gotten this far with me, it probably won't surprise you to learn that I do not think we encounter Satan in Job 1 and 2. I think we encounter Satan, who is one of the sons of God. He is a part of the divine council. He has been assigned a role by God. The text of Job tells us what that role is. He goes around on earth looking for people to accuse. He is a private investigator assigned by God to find out if people really do serve God for the right reasons. And God brings up Job, and the Satan is not so sure that Job does serve God for the right reasons. According to this reading strategy, it's not that the Satan is Job's enemy, certainly not God's enemy, but the Satan suspects that Job is just a little too perfect, and there must be something he's hiding. Let's imagine a similar case. What if you ran a daycare, and someone you've known all your life applied for a job at the daycare? You have no concern about this person being around kids. You know this person is a faithful churchgoer, has a good family, has raised a good set of kids. Would you ask this person as a part of the application process to submit to a background check? Of course you would. First of all, it's the law, but secondly, there are too many cases we've heard about of exactly this kind of thing. Someone hiring a trusted friend who ends up abusing people. Imagine you have kids, and imagine if you're shopping around for daycares for your own children, and one of the daycares tells you they haven't done background checks on their employees. Is there any chance your kids would be going to that daycare? What if they said they'd done background checks on most of the employees, but not the janitor? And anyway, he's a really sweet guy who loves being around kids. Good luck with that. We'll find a different daycare. Or let's go in a different direction. What are some of the questions that a potential campaign manager is going to ask a political candidate before signing on to run a campaign? It's going to get pretty personal, pretty invasive, pretty fast. Tell me about any extramarital affair or any time you've kissed someone beside your spouse, even if you just kissed the back of the person's head. Tell me about anyone besides your spouse whose shoulders you've rubbed or whom you've touched in any way that someone else might interpret as sexual. Tell me about your finances, yours and the finances of your whole extended family. Tell me about any addictions you've ever had or anyone in your extended family. Tell me about any police records in your family. I'm not saying that God needs to run a background check on Job before he knows whether Job is really who he seems to be. It's more like God needs to run a background check on Job so that God can show everyone, including Job, that Job is really who he seems to be. That there are people in the world who serve God not for the perks, but because they really do love God. I think we can even imagine that there had been some suspicion among God's heavenly servants that God is not administering justice fairly, that he's giving Job special treatment. Everyone else has to endure various hardships, but Job lives a cushy life, protected by God. So the Satan brings up this possibility. The result is all to the glory of God. If we think about the book of Job after chapter 2, who is to blame for all of Job's sufferings? The Satan is never mentioned in the book again. And all the characters, even God, agree that it was God who brought suffering on Job. He's the one responsible. Now, that fact in itself does not prove that the Satan is not Satan, since God can use even Satan for his own purposes, think crucifixion. And you might read the Lord's comment to the Satan in Job 2:3, "You incited me against him to destroy him without reason," as indicating a strain in the relationship between God and the Satan, maybe because the Satan is Satan. I think that interpretation would be pushing God's comment too far, given the lack of a Satan figure in the Old Testament. I am inclined to think of the character labeled the Satan as one of the sons of God giving his regular report to the Lord, just like everybody else. That's why they've come into the presence of God, to report to God what they've been up to. Not someone intending to bring pain to God, nor intending to entice Job to sin, just intending to show that Job is not so perfect after all. One more point. This reading strategy answers the common question from readers of Job: how can Satan be in heaven? The answer is, he's not. There are other questions I would like to get into, but we haven't the time. I'm already over time. No matter what interpretation one prefers, I would argue that there is no instance in which the Hebrew word Satan is used as a proper name, and therefore there is no Old Testament passage in which one ought to read in our English Bibles about Satan with a capital S. It would be much better if translations would talk about the adversary or the opponent. That translation choice would leave the matter open enough that readers of the English Bible could make their own decisions about the identity of this character.